Much for having me. I hope you'll indulge me when I got the message to come give a talk here. I was in the beginning stages of outlining a review that I wanted to do, and so I thought I would use this opportunity to motivate that process, and with the hopes that I would be able to use everyone's brain power to highlight any things that I've missed. Just to begin, the mating, the reproductive and parenting patterns that we see in humans are unique in the mammalian world. While residing in these large multi-male, multi-female groups of varying compositions of relatedness, of relations, we couple off into these long-term pair-bonded relationships within which the majority of human reproduction takes place. And these pair bonds have been culturally reimagined in a variety of ways as the institution of marriage. Many have tried to create a definition of marriage that is meaningful and inclusive of all of the different varieties we see in the ethnographic record, but it's very challenging because some of the elements that are very important to some cultures, such as the bestowal of legitimacy to children, are completely absent in others. But there are patterns that we don't see. There are no cultures, there are no populations that exhibit patterns that resemble those of chimpanzees or gorillas, suggesting that there are some definable limitations to the institution of marriage. What we do see in all cultures is we see long-term reproductive relationships. If a pair reproduce, it's much more likely that they are going to have another child with each other than they are with some random person in the population. And this is one of the remarkable features of human relationships, the fact that we have these so-called iteroparous long-term reproductive relationships in these large groups. Nearly universally, we see some expectation of sexual preference, typically the expectation of sexual exclusivity. And we also see high levels of economic cooperation, often in the form of biparental investment. A man and woman who have had a child together are much more likely to economically cooperate than they are with random individuals in the population. And this remarkable mating system spurred the uniqueness of this remarkable mating system has spurred numerous attempts to provide an adaptive explanation. And probably the most long-standing adaptive explanation is the paternal provisioning model, which links our mating systems, our parental patterns, to the evolutionary development of increasingly costly children. Compared to apes, our children are very altricial. In two ways. They are born helpless, they're completely useless, and they are huge encumbrances to parents, as Brooke is dealing with today. Not that, I wouldn't say encumbrance, but you know. And they have a prolonged development. They're nutritionally dependent for a much larger proportion of their lifespan. Furthermore, we wean our children early. This is a hallmark feature of human reproductive patterns in which we wean them early and then we provision them, allowing for resumption of fertility so that we have this so-called stacked fertility. So the average family has multiple dependents of varying levels of maturation. So in short, their children are needier, they're needier for a longer period of time, and there's more of them. Now, often combined in this with the neediness argument is this idea that human fathers and mothers work together, they divide labor, and they achieve this complementarity such that they get even higher returns by working together. They're able to accomplish mutually prohibitive tasks, and they're able to reap the benefits of specialization. And so essentially the argument is that there's this greater well of need to fill, which means that the returns to parental investment saturate much later, and you get this added boost through this complementarity such that it pays fathers to stick around in humans more so than other apes, and for women to choose such men. However, that would be great. It seemed nice for such a long time, but doubts have grown. If we just start, for instance, with the benefits that men receive, oftentimes it is presented as this benefit in increasing the quality of children, the survivorship of children, the fitness of children. Here we see among the Tsimane, for instance, the survivorship of children who have their father around for the first 15 years. And you can see that there is an appreciable effect. If the father dies in the first year, they're much more likely to also die, supposedly because, to some degree at least, of this lack of investment. And as he dies later, you can see that it becomes less important of an effect. But at least in the first 5 years, you see a substantial effect with an odds ratio of around 3. And we can ask ourselves, hey, well, that seems pretty good. But how much benefit is this really? If we take two individuals who are married to a standard 30-year-old Tsimane woman with average fertility, they have in their family a progeny with this age profile. Well, nobody's going to have this age profile, but on average, they will have a distribution like this. And we can calculate with the standard mortality how many children will die to standard mortality with the father present versus how many are lost if the father is absent. And we can subtract these two, and we can get the actual cost of desertion or the benefit of sticking around. And it's around 0.16 for more children will die on average if a man is absent who is married to a 30-year-old woman. We can calculate this for all ages then, and then we can ask the question, well, how does this compare to the opportunity cost? What if the man were to desert? What is the minimum age difference between the first wife and the second wife that would be necessary to compensate for this cost in child mortality? And for Tsimane, it turns out that throughout the life course of the marriage, it's almost always preferable, it's beneficial for a man to desert if he can find a woman that's even a year younger. Meaning that this benefit, even when applied to all children, never goes above the age-specific fertility rate. And when we look at it for other groups, it's the same, that it never really is high enough to overcome relatively minor alternatives. So there were ways that we worked around this to keep the paternal provisioning model alive and breathing, but now we've had two additional developments that have occurred recently that have grown this out even further. The first is that we have these two recent large-scale comparative analyses that have attempted to model the evolution of monogamy in mammals and primates. And they don't agree on much. But what they do agree on is that the evidence strongly suggests that paternal care almost universally evolves after monogamy has already been established, suggesting that the benefits of biparental care are not a driving force in the evolution of monogamy. Another major development has been this realignment of sexual selection theory, spurred by a number of influential papers and led largely by Hannah Coco and her colleagues. The original formulation, as developed by Trivers and Emlyn and Oring and so forth, posited that it was the initial difference in parental investment that led to these differences. And so if you start with this initial difference, what that means is that the higher investing sex has to spend more time out of the mating pool. The lower investing sex has a higher reproductive rate and can return to the mating pool more quickly. And as this plays out, this leads to a biased operational sex ratio such that the higher investing sex becomes a limiting resource. And the higher investing sex, therefore, has to engage in greater competition. There's a greater potential for sexual selection to act, and you get the evolution of stereotypical sex roles, which is the standard model. Now, Coco and colleagues pointed out that regardless of the potential for the lower investing sex to return to the mating pool, it doesn't necessarily mean that they should. And all things being equal, the fact that the operational sex ratio is actually biased with an overabundance of that sex actually reduces the returns to mating effort. And therefore, operational sex ratio shouldn't be conceptualized as an outcome as a driver of the evolution of these sex strategies, but more as an outcome itself that co-evolves with all the other factors that go into determining the payoffs to engaging in mating effort or parenting effort. And so with the reformulating of these earlier models with the added constraint that male and female average fitness must be equal, that every child must have a father and a mother, they argue that there are other variables, other factors that are more likely to be foundational determinants of these strategies. One is adult sex ratio, which determines what the average benefit to engaging in mating effort is going to be, such that more male-biased adult sex ratios are going to lead to a reduction in the returns to mating effort for men, more likely to result in comparable sex strategies. Female-biased sex ratio should lead to higher rates of polygyny and so forth. Variance in and awareness of mating competitiveness. And so any factors that influence how variable males are, particularly in their ability to win more mates, while it might be more costly for males in general to engage in mating effort in a male-biased OSR, it might still be worthwhile for certain males to re-enter the mating pool, particularly if they know that they're going to do well. Parentage. This often relates to males, not always, but if there are exogenous factors like foraging strategies that influence males' ability to be certain of their offspring, that might influence sexual strategies. And finally, exclusivity of parenting and mating effort. For instance, among some fish, or among a number of fish species, the males will provide parental care by fanning the eggs, and the care is largely non-depreciable, so that a male engaging in parenting care is not really inhibited from accepting more mates. And in fact, if females are preferring those males who are signaling willingness to invest, parenting effort might actually enhance rather than detract from mating success. And I think it's testament to the cogency of these arguments that since the development of these ideas, each one of these has been invoked in a new model of the evolution of human mating systems. Recently, we saw Coxworth et al. Published the grandmothering article arguing that menopause, or the extension of the lifespan, which evolved for other reasons, had this effect of essentially removing women permanently from the reproductive mating pool, in essence altering the adult sex ratio so that it became male biased, which should lead to a shift in the optimal balance between mating effort and parenting effort in men, so that they were engaging in more parenting effort or mate guarding, less mating effort. Bernard Chapais, all right, we'll go with that, argued that it was a reduction in variance in men's competitiveness that led, what he argued was a shift from a conglomeration of polygynous one-male units to a group of monogamous pairs. And he argued that it was the development of weaponry that led to this reduction in competitive variance. And if you have a gun, for instance, it doesn't matter how large the person is, it actually makes it easier to shoot them, probably. And finally, Gavrilets, everybody, Gavrilets? Okay, we'll go with Gavrilets. In a slightly more elaborate model, and the only one involving biparental care. He formalized a model that had been hit on by some others, myself included. I talked about some of these ideas earlier, but he formalized this into a model in which really essentially it was based on female choice, on female and women preferring investing males and offering some degree of faithfulness. And this argument is based on the idea that if you already have variance, for instance, in willingness to engage in or invest parentally, for instance, if you start off just with variance in competitive ability, those males who have lower competitive ability might be more reluctant to re-enter the mating pool. It might be more willing to stick around. If you also have variance in preference and they're able to match up, you might end up seeing that this female choice sparks the initial trajectory down towards monogamous pair bonds. And this can make sense. I think if you look, for instance, from the male perspective, when to parentally invest, it's when the returns to the parental effort discounted by the probability of paternity are greater than the returns to mating effort. But from the female perspective, she doesn't care about paternity or opportunity costs experienced by the male. For the female, it's whether or not the returns to choosing an investing male are greater than the costs imposed by the constrained mate choice. And this threshold might be passed earlier than the threshold from the male perspective. Okay, so they're relatively new models, and they deserve their chance to go head to head. So we can use three approaches here. They're often used to explore the viability of these models. We can look at functional design. This, as we'll see, it can get somewhat difficult, but ideally, you can look at the tightness of fit, the economy of design, and so forth. We can look at the comparative record to see if the proposed factors are also leading to the evolution of monogamy in other species. And we can look at the chronology in the fossil record. Okay, so we'll start with functional design. Now, regarding the menopause and the leveling models, there are three reasons why it's difficult to make predictions with regards to functional design. The first is that they're not really proposing any adaptive solutions to problems. They're really proposing adaptive shifts in the balance of trade-offs. Furthermore, we can't take these factors and use them to predict how people should behaviorally respond. The fact that they predict these evolutionary trajectories does not immediately lead to the prediction that people should respond that way, unless there's also been the selection for adaptive plasticity. And finally, there are issues that arise because while these factors are thought to influence the evolutionary trajectory of these mating systems, other factors that influence the evolution of these mating systems should also impact these factors. And so, for instance, with regards to adult sex ratio, if mating effort is consistently riskier activity, that would mean, for instance, if males are engaging in a lot of mating effort, that more of them will die and you'll have a female-biased sex ratio, which is exactly what you're using to predict the mating-intensive strategies in men. It doesn't mean that it's not true, it's just that it's very difficult to tease apart direction of causality. Similarly, and you can start to see this even more so with leveling, the idea that we should expect that variance in men's competitiveness should be driving men's strategies. And that can get quite confusing. Now, female choice model is the only thing that really posits something resembling functional design. And we should see, for instance, many things that we really already kind of know. We should see that women prefer investors. We should see that women profit, perhaps more than men if they were passing this threshold earlier. We should see that men's strategies are associated with status, and that somehow men are able to signal their parental intent. Okay, so looking at the menopause model, here you can see that even Coco threw her hat into the ring with human cultures there. And it is the case that estimates of adult sex ratio do correspond with mating system. This is something that's been known for quite some time. In the 70s, Ember and Ember, one of the Embers, reported this, and it was largely based on the idea that if you have more women and you have this expectation that everyone should be married, you're naturally going to have polygyny. Not so much that when you have an equal sex ratio that men feel compelled to help out more because they feel that it's harder out there. But it is the case that you do tend to see this, and more recently, Ryan Scott reported that adult sex ratio was also associated with this measure of the opportunity for sexual selection, and he found that it was actually higher in female-biased cultures, although it's a fairly small sample, which again was somewhat counterintuitive to the idea that when you have lots of males together, that's when you're going to have a lot of competition and a lot of opportunity for sexual selection. Okay, what about the leveling hypothesis? For this one, again, it's something that's been predicted for quite a long period of time. In evolutionary ecology, this is not new stuff. The polygyny threshold model, for instance, specifically models polygyny as an outcome of variance in men's mate values. In humans, we do see that rates of polygyny vary, for instance, by national Gini coefficient. However, again, it's difficult to fully tease apart the direction of causality and whether or not this is the outcome of fairly long-term cultural evolution, or if it actually is humans responding adaptively in real time to the mating mark that is out there. There's been some work on what's going on college campuses that are becoming increasingly female biased in the sex ratio, and how that might be having an impact on students' sexual strategies as well. So that goes to the earlier one, but it's hard to figure out what's causing what here. Okay, female choice. Do women prefer investors? Yes. But it should be pointed out how ubiquitous this is and how fairly substantial it is. In Buss's seminal work in '89 with the 37 cultures, this was the only one, I think, that went 37 for 37. There might have been the age difference one as well. One of them was non-significant. But in all 37 cultures, women preferred financial prospects more so than men. If you look at the ratio of financial prospects to good looks, 70% of cultures, women preferred financial prospects more than good looks, whereas for men, it was only 1. So you can see that this seems to be a fairly standard preference profile for women. And it seems to keep them happy in marriage. This was from a study among a Nicaraguan population, and you can see that of the 9 individuals that reported a low satisfaction in marriage, all 9 of them were below average in their ranking as investors. Oops, sorry. Furthermore, in addition to the original benefits in child survivorship, there is a fair bit of evidence that this investment from men also increases the impaired fertility. Not all studies have found this, but a number of particularly hunter-gatherer populations, they have found this. And furthermore, when you look across populations, the percentage of male contribution to diet is associated with total fertility rate, suggesting that women are benefiting substantially from this investment. And all around the world, something that people often just, completely ignore because it's so obvious, is that women who are in a marriage tend to have higher fertility rates than women who are not in marriage. And this is an important observation, though, that around the world, women prefer to reproduce within a marriage as opposed to outside of a marriage, despite the fact that they're not really that behaviorally or sexually limited as men might be to reproduce outside of marriage. And here among the Tumani, you can see the huge cost of the death of a husband. This is the probability, the percentage reproducing within the next 10 years with a husband who has not died compared to with a husband who has died. And so you see that a large percentage cease reproducing once their husband disappears, again, despite the fact that if they wanted to get pregnant, there would be even somewhat culturally appropriate ways to do so. However, it's very difficult to estimate the opportunity costs, the cost of constrained mate choice in women. Perhaps We could explore the outcomes of children, of half siblings who are born to the same mother, some of whom are born to the resident father, others who were surreptitiously sired by an extra pair partner with the expectation that they would do better, although you'd have to account for the fact that they may not resemble the father, and that tends to be associated with investment patterns, but that has yet to be done. What about men's status? Again, we should see that men who experience lower returns on the mating market should invest more in parenting effort. And again, there have been a number of studies, and overall, you see more of these negative effects than anything else. You do see some non-effects, but no effects in the other direction. Here in Belize, facial attractiveness, for instance, was negatively associated to some degree with investment in kin. So although the difficulty with this is you can get phenotypic correlation such that men who are more competitive on the mating market outside of their investment in children might also invest more, for instance, if they're higher status or they have more resources. And finally, honest signals. There has to be a way for men to honestly signal their parental intent and for women to receive this honest signal if this model is correct. And throughout the world, we do see these very costly displays of romantic love. You have these time-wasting displays. You have the purchasing of plants that are going to die within a week, and if you purchased, silk flowers, it's not as romantic. You have huge transactions of very substantial amounts of wealth, which could act as these honest signals. There have been some studies looking at how faithful these honest signals are with varying degrees of success. You seem to get different results with, for instance, how much you spend on a wedding ring, things like that. However, I haven't yet seen any study that looks cross-culturally on the chance for deception, how polymorphic it is, and how substantial the signal must be, which would be, I think, in an interesting direction. Okay, so we get to our subjective analysis, and you might disagree with me. But again, given, I think, the fact that these are very weak predictions, we can't really say that much. But it seems that humans are at least are engaging and acting in a way that is in keeping with the female choice model. So we can move to the comparative record. Now we still have the issue with the direction of causality in the comparative record, although we no longer have the problem with the evolutionary versus behavioral timescale. And so now we can predict that adult sex ratios should be associated with mating strategies, leveling, that mating success variance should be associated with mating strategies. For female choice, we should see that biparental care is associated with mating strategies, and since they're actually postulating a STEM or social organization, we should see the existence of polymorphic multi-male, multi-female species. And what we do see is that there haven't been that many formal studies that have been done, since the ideas are fairly new on a species by species level. But those that have been done, particularly in birds, have found that adult sex ratios are associated with these mating systems. For instance, this is a study looking at shorebirds, which famously have a number of role reverse species. And in these role reverse species, they tend to have a high female biased, a very low female biased sex ratio. Am I getting that right? No, I'm getting it wrong. I'm sorry, yes. A very male biased sex ratio. And again, the direction of causality comes into question here. If those role reverse species, if females are suffering from higher mortality rates, that might lead to the sex ratio difference in and of itself. Others have argued that the overall male biased sex ratio in birds compared to the female biased sex ratio in mammals actually can explain these widespread differences across these large taxa. Now with variance in mating success, it gets a little bit trickier, again, because the link between mating system and variance in mating success is so strong. And in fact, some have used the ratio of variance in male reproductive success to female reproductive success as a more accurate measure of polygyny. So you can't just look at these causations, these correlations. Now, there are some specific examples that primatologists have proffered that might suggest that individuals are purposefully reducing male-male competition because of this reduction of variance, and because of the potential lethality of the contests. So you see this, for instance, perhaps among Barbary macaques who refrain from engaging in these agonistic encounters, and hamadryas baboons. And the primatologist sometimes uses the language that they respect the rights of other males to access to these females, very much like you see in marriage, although that might be anthropomorphizing. And then what about the female choice model? Well, as I said before, the two major phylogenetic reconstructions of mating systems found that paternal care was subsequent to the development of monogamous pair bonds. But it should be noted that these two studies failed to agree on virtually anything else. They didn't agree on the stem social pattern of primates. They didn't agree on whether or not monogamy always evolves from group living or always evolves from solitary living. They failed to agree on what drives this shift to monogamy, whether it's infanticide risk, whether it's female distribution. And there's still a lot of confusion. It hasn't been settled. They're still going back and forth, and some of the major players in this field they've written papers where they simply say, yeah, there's lots of confusion. The data sets are very large and complex. How you record whether or not infanticide exists, for instance, can get tricky. And the methods as well are very complex. So it's somewhat difficult to assess whether or not, or the degree to which the pattern of humans evolving from a likely multi-male, multi-female promiscuous group to monogamous pairs is really unusual. And furthermore, just the simple fact that we have this mating system of these monogamous pairs embedded within these large groups, which is completely unique to humans, except for maybe the mara, which are these rodents in Argentina. But barring those, it's completely unique among mammals that it requires us to use some caution in inferring the male story from these patterns. That being said, it does make it less likely. All things being equal, this does not in any way support the mating effort model or the female choice model. The other aspect of it that we should see the STEM social organization that is proposed in the female choice model. In nature, we do see that in a number of species, particularly a number of baboon species and in chimpanzees, that males and females will develop these consortships in which they spend more time together, they engage more together, and they're more likely to mate and to reproduce together. Furthermore, in both species, there's evidence that males somehow are able to detect offspring that are theirs and direct support or some kind of investment towards them. And so the variation that's proposed in the female choice model does seem to exist in primates. And in fact, it exists in our closest cousins, suggesting that the stage was set. Okay. For this one, adult sex ratios, we see good evidence. The studies that have come out suggest that it's associated with these mating systems. The leveling, again, there's already a huge pathway of causality in the opposite direction, so it's hard to make any inference from that. For female choice, the comparative analyses really put a dent in that one. So now we can go to the fossil record. Now the fossil record, you can only really make very gross level statements about chronology, which isn't such a bad thing because these hypotheses make very gross level predictions. So for instance, the menopause model suggests that pair bonding should not evolve long before the evolution of the extended lifespan. Furthermore, male provisioning should not appear long before the extended lifespan. The leveling model suggests that similarly, pair bonding and provisioning should not occur long before the development of projectile weapons. And finally, the female choice model suggests that pair bonding should not occur long before provisioning. So we can hopefully gather some information about these events. Unfortunately, as with many things in paleoanthropology, you end up with a lot of maybe. So we'll see. Okay, pair bonding. How can we determine the time for this? Oftentimes, we typically refer to sexual dimorphism. And sexual dimorphism, the ratio of male to female body size, is supposed to be associated with the returns to winning intersexual competitions. And so therefore, you tend to see that there's higher levels of degrees of sexual dimorphism in polygynous species. And if you look just at apes, you get this really nice pattern. And you see that humans tend to be comparable to the hylobatids. If you add the cercopithecines and the colobines and the platyrrhines, it gets a little bit hairier. But what you can see is that if you have a very high degree of sexual dimorphism, it's very unlikely that it's monogamous. If you have a low degree of sexual dimorphism, it's more likely that you're monogamous, but you can see that you still see species in the other groups that also have low degrees of sexual dimorphism. All right, so that sounds great. Let's check this out, but there are a number of challenges. First of all, we need to make sure that we're dealing with the same species and the same population, and this can be difficult in the paleo record. For instance, here you can see two individuals that are likely have similar ancestry and two individuals who do not, and you would get completely opposite measures of sexual dimorphism. You also need to know which specimens are male and which specimens are female, and typically you don't have something as diagnostic as the pelvis. And so oftentimes what they simply do is if you look at the distribution of afarensis estimates and africanus estimates, is they say, oh, well, there's a nice little separation right there. We'll just call that the separation. Then you got your males and your females, which naturally is going to inflate the estimate of sexual dimorphism. Now, that being said, you can also simply look at the coefficient of variation and sexually dimorphic population species. When you pool both males and females, they tend to exhibit a higher degree of variance in the overall size distribution. So you can get around this in some ways. You have to estimate body size from the materials that you have. The femoral head size tends to be very predictive, but you don't always have femoral head size. And so based on what you use, sometimes these estimates can shift. And then once you have all of that, let's say that it is perfect, you got it perfectly estimated, you still have to interpret the mating system based on this sexual dimorphism. And it can sometimes get a little bit complex. For instance, with humans, we tend to have a low to moderate degree of sexual dimorphism. But if you take into account the fact that women tend to be very fatty, and if you just look at muscle sexual dimorphism, now humans become more sexually dimorphic. And then you can ask the question, well, does the fat deposits on women, does that allow them to compete more physically? And we don't really know. Now, we're trying to really interpret the investment in winning intersexual mating contests. But all in all, when we look at all of this data together, the general consensus is that there's a fair degree of agreement that afarensis seem to be fairly sexually dimorphic. There are detractors. Reno is often, you always see that, but C, as I have down there. Reno et al., who argues based on different sampling techniques that they were not sexually dimorphic. The habilines, there aren't enough, and they likely come from multiple species, and they have no idea which sex any specimen is. So it still seems to be high, but it's very low confidence. And typically it's with the erectus sensulato that you get this reduction in sexual dimorphism. You have a reduction in the overall degree of the coefficient of variation in the entire sample that suggests that you have this substantial reduction in sexual dimorphism in erectus. And so that's typically what is reported in the literature as the best guess for when you see this reduction. Okay, what about male provisioning? Well, there are a number of ways we can try to infer that male provisioning is taking place. First of all, we can ask, is provisioning necessary? And so a number of researchers have explored this question through looking at the developmental and energetic requirements. They argue, I'm sorry, not there, that compared to Africanus, it seems that erectus would have required some 50 to 80% more calories based on body size and estimated daily ranges. And Opie and Power calculated that even with conservative estimates from living foraging groups, that females would have fallen about 20% short, suggesting some degree of provisioning. Furthermore, others have argued that with the encephalization experienced by Homo erectus, that you would have had increasingly altricial infants, which would have required carrying. This is probably before the development of slings. And Lee Gettler actually argues that this is an opportune moment in which males could have started helping out through carrying, actually. But perhaps the biggest shift that has happened in the past 15 years or 20 years or so has been in the exploration of dental development. The general consensus is that early Homo maintained a rate of development that was accelerated and indistinguishable from ape patterns until fairly recent, until even after the Homo sapiens and Neanderthal split. So with dental growth, you see the circadian pattern of dentine and enamel deposition, which can then be read. And here you can see, for instance, this is often given as the earliest example of a human-like life history developmental rate, which is 160,000 years old. And these studies have been fairly consistent, showing that here you have early Homo, which is aligned with the green line, which is the African rates, the African apes, that the rate of deposition is more rapid, and the teeth are growing more quickly, essentially. So much so now, for instance, the Nicaraguan kid, which has nearly complete adult dentition, is now calculated to be less than 10 years old as opposed to being a teenager. And dental development is strongly linked to other life history milestones, and so they infer from this the overall life history trajectory. One of the milestones that is very important in assessing whether or not provisioning is needed is weaning. And they have tried to tackle this in a number of ways as well. They looked at molar eruption times, but that has largely now been thrown out. They looked at weaning-induced stressors, these hypoplasias that are associated with the nutritional stress that comes with weaning. But the best bet seems to be evaluations of tooth chemistry. And so as teeth develop, they calcify this chronological record of the chemical makeup of the available nutrients as they shift from placenta to nursing to weaning foods. And using, for instance, the barium to calcium ratio, which is often used to determine trophic level. They found that they can identify basically the change throughout the tooth physically of when weaning occurs. The method is described as semi-destructive. So they're reluctant to use it, and it can only be used with very well-preserved specimens. So the only hominin that they've used it on so far was a Neanderthal tooth that they discovered was abruptly weaned at 1.2 years, which is really weird. And so hopefully we'll see in the future more of these studies and be able to get a better, much more accurate understanding. These can be very precise with regards to the age of these milestones. So one hypothesis might be, for instance, that you see this very late development of this human life history rate. And so it might be that early Homo was still exhibiting this ape-like pattern of very late weaning, stretching that ape schedule to its demographic limits. And then relatively recently we see this solution of this really early weaning followed by extensive provisioning. So based on this, we can't now say that early Homo clearly was requiring a great deal of provisioning because of this early weaning. However, we can't eliminate it. But the idea that this early weaning was occurring very early in the evolution of humans seems unlikely. What else can we look at? We can try to look at foraging strategies. Now, the most recent review of foraging strategies, specifically in reference to male reproductive strategies, was by O'Connell and Lupo in 2003. And they argued that there was very little evidence for early adoption of a meat-eating strategy in early Homo. And they argued that it was much more likely that we evolved this protracted lifespan much earlier than that, and so that we could just eliminate this idea that hunting or that meat eating was in any way influential in driving the evolution of these other life history patterns. So now we've had another 14 years of evidence or so, and so we can see what they found. So if we look at access to carcasses, over the past 15, 20 years or so, there has been a shift. If you take the man, the hunter model that dominated the mid-20th century, it switched to man, the scavenger model in the latter half of the last part of the 20th century. And since then, it's shifted back a little bit. And researchers can infer whether or not they've had access to these carcasses, to near intact early access to carcasses in a number of ways. They can look at the completeness of the skeleton. They can look at the patterning of the cut marks, whether that they suggest complete butchery or butchery of choice parts like evisceration. They can look at the frequencies of tooth marks and cut marks. And so if we look at these sites, for instance, Rabinovich report and colleagues report an 800,000-year-old Acheulean site in Israel in which you have loads of deer that appear to be consistently butchered. And this site probably provides the best evidence that you can have active hunting going on with Acheulean technology. Going back further in time, you can see the midshaft of bovid longbone from a 1.8 million year old Cubi-4 assemblage in which very, very few specimens exhibit any carnivore tooth marks. I think it was 4 specimens. Even at Olduvai Gorge, the Zinj assemblage, which has been analyzed and reanalyzed ad nauseum, they are now, there are arguments that the original calculation of tooth marks was artificially inflated by mistakes with chemical trails. And when evaluating the age distribution, here you can see, for instance, juvenile old individuals and then the prime individuals down here. The wildebeest herd is right around here, and the lion kill is a little bit more towards the old and the young, away from the prime. The Zinj assemblage, I'm sorry, there's the wildebeest. The Zinj assemblage is much more focused on prime individuals and actually overlaps substantially with the ethnographic examples of modern hunter-gatherers. And the most recently described site, the Canjera South assemblage, going back to 2 million years, which is an Olduvai site. And the authors argue that the high number of small bovids, which are typically quickly consumed by carnivores, and the low number of tooth marks, which are in keeping with ethnographic primary axis kills and not in keeping with the carnivore first kills, suggest that they had primary access to these carcasses. So all in all, the consensus basically is that there's still a great deal of debate, but there's been a shift to making it slightly earlier. If we look at technology, some have argued that there's no way that they could have had the technological capabilities, particularly Olduvai technology of taking down these medium-sized bovids. But it should be noted that there are a number of non-lithic technologies that are in the ethnographic record. The oldest non-lithic weapon is this 400,000-year-old wooden spear from Germany. So it might simply be that these weapons are not being preserved. There's also the question as to whether or not you have central place foraging, where they're bringing these sites represent home bases, or if they represent near kill butcher sites. If they are home bases, it's much more likely that the meat is being distributed and provisioning is taking place. If they're butcher sites, it doesn't necessarily negate this possibility, but it makes it less likely. Perhaps the best evidence for central place is unambiguous hearths. And these pop up around 500,000 years in a number of sites. Prior to that, recent analyses have suggested strongly through indirect evidence that sites in Israel with the deer butchering site, as well as Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa, where it's very unlikely that natural fire would have entered that far into the cave. And so that has also been pushed back in time. So that's provisioning. Overall, or if you look at the developmental traits or the developmental rates, that's been pushed earlier in time. The importance of meat, access to carcasses, has been pushed further back in time over the past 15, 20 years. If we look at menopause, the adult lifespan, similarly, numerous researchers have relied on allometric relationships to estimate the lifespan, and based on brain size, based on body size, Judge and Carey here argue that it's around Homo erectus is when you start to see a long enough lifespan such that you have regular post-reproductive life stage. However, if you take into account the dental developmental rates, others have argued that these are more predictive of lifespan. If you look at markers of developmental rates, such as age at first birth, the fit with maximum lifespan does tend to be tighter than brain and body size. If you throw all three into a model, the other two drop out, and you're just left with age of first birth. So at the very least, the suggestion is that we should, the estimates should be downgraded somewhat, and if we rely on developmental rates, they actually provide an estimate that's closer to ape-like lifespans. Additionally, others have looked at old to young ratios in the paleo record, and depending on which method is used to assess tooth wear, you either get this big jump in the ratio of old individuals once you get to the early Paleolithic. Trinkhaus did not. And so there's a great deal of debate surrounding this, and even whether or not this old to young ratio is a good measure of maximal lifespan. But many have used this to argue that the evolution of the long-lived lifespan occurs fairly recently. Okay, what about the leveling hypothesis? Well, this really depends on what you need to easily kill someone. If I gave you an Acheulean hand axe, for instance, would you be able to take down Andre the Giant? Probably more easily. It would be a better chance than if you were hand-to-hand, but body size might still play a major role. We don't know what other types of weaponry were out there. You don't really see the true equalizers, the spear throwers or the bows and arrows until well into the Upper Paleolithic. So it's kind of difficult to judge how much this really equalizes men's competition. With female choice, with this model we do see that the male provisioning, or at least evidence of importance of meat, has been pushed back, and it tends to align with the timing in which we see this reduction in, or the best guess for this reduction in sexual dimorphism. So in the end, With this one, the menopause seemed to fare the worst over the past 2 decades. The leveling, we're not sure. You do see weaponry that is at least capable of taking down animals, most likely, around the time of this reduction of sexual dimorphism. And female choice, you do see that they do coincide. And so when you look across these, you see that the importance of paternal provisioning as at least an influential player in the evolution of pair bonding is not completely dead, but it's definitely taking a different shape in this female choice model. For things that would be great to figure out, the determination of weaning ages, I think, is going to be occurring fairly rapidly, and that will be very important in determining when provisioning is absolutely essential. Because with weaning, allomaternal provisioning is a prerequisite for early weaning to be a viable strategy. If anybody wants to look at, I don't know, martial arts data to see when body size stops becoming that influential in determining the outcome of contests, that would be interesting to see. The cost of constrained mate choice to women, actually, like the Himba might be a good example in which you could explore the outcomes of children who are sired from an extra pair sire. As well as the signals of parental intent, I think, are another good area of research that would be fruitful to determine if the populations in which there is more of a propensity or more of a potential for deceit, that there is a greater demand for these signals of intent. But also note that there are lots of confounding factors, because those males which are most successful in the mating market, who might be most likely to engage in deceit, might also be the most valuable to women. They provide that additional value, and so women's demands for signal might be lowered. And that's how you get all the romantic comedies that exist in the world. And that's also I just wanted to thank these people that helped me work out these ideas, and I'm happy to take any of your questions.
I think that you were adducing this in the context of making the female choice argument, but you pointed out that women across a wide number of societies rarely reproduce, or their reproduction rates decline precipitously following the death of a partner. And you said, given the market dynamics, it's not that they're going to have difficulty finding a partner. So this supports, if I understood you correctly, you were using that in support of female choice. And that's perfectly plausible, but it seems to me that it ignores the larger sociocultural context of patriarchy, and that in the vast majority of societies, there is, at the very least, stigma attached to reproducing in that context. And often there may be severe sanctions against those women. And you can look at that as, an outgrowth of a male social contract in which there is control of female reproductive behavior that may be completely in opposition to, female strategic interests. So I don't know that. I'm all in favor of a larger comparative enterprise. I'm not criticizing that at all. But I am saying that when you focus on findings like that, humans are not just another primate from which you can draw the same kinds of conclusions about the strategies or motives that are explaining a given pattern of reproductive behavior.
No, I absolutely agree with that. I kind of laughed there because I remember when I was an early graduate student and I was presenting for the first time, someone said, "That's Dan Fesler in the audience. He's going to be the first to ask you a question," because he always asks you a question. No, and I absolutely agree with that. I think that you have to take into account the patriarchal limitations to women's or the limitations that the patriarchy places on women's option set, and that's why we have to rely on a panoply of evidence types in order to try to evaluate these adaptive scenarios. And one of those is how universal a behavior is. And so if across the board, if you see in cultures in which you have a strong patriarchy, as well as in those cultures in which women's sexual options are not as constrained, that there still is a preference for reproduction within these marital unions, I think that adds more weight to that contention.
That's one way of addressing it. Another way of addressing it is looking at the frequency as a function of the intensity of patriarchy, right?
Yeah.
So if it's inversely related, then that strongly suggests that women are really being constrained by the cultural context, and that the more freedom they have, the more they exercise it.
Right, really you could just look at those populations in which they
have complete choice.
Yeah. But in this one, it's something that, to be honest with you, I haven't seen any analyses, because it's something that, if you ask, do women have higher reproductive rates when they're married than when they're not? It's almost like a nonsensical question in many populations. But yeah, I agree that more liberal, sexually liberal populations would definitely be a better test for that.
Sorry that
That's okay.
leveling my voice. Weaponry as leveling, I mean, it seems like a plausible thing, but if you look, and leveling can mean different things, I guess, in different contexts, but, as you know, in foraging societies, there's lots of cultural leveling mechanisms that decrease inequality in many ways that, I mean, maybe they're backed up with the threat of force, but it's not even clear that they are, really.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I agree that the weaponry thing is kind of like a one-way look for this in the fossil record and the archaeological record, but are there other things that you could do?
It's a good question, and it might be that initially the leveling and physical competitiveness came first, and that's what allowed for the further elaboration of these mechanisms that drove egalitarianism. And that's often used as an explanation of why we don't see very high rates of polygyny in foraging populations, because there is such a degree of egalitarianism that it rarely makes sense for a woman to become the second partner of an already paired man. In the fossil record, I presume you could possibly look at variation in intersexual body size. And since it would be much more, in subsistence level populations, body size tends to be much more sensitive to energetic balances. So that might be a measure of variance, but yeah, that would be a tough one. The poor paleoanthropologists are trying their hardest to do the best with what they have, and sometimes when you wade into this literature, you at first are just amazed with what they can figure out with what they have, but at the end you're often disappointed at what you're still left with.
So this is super interesting and on my field, so maybe this question is a little misguided, but I'm curious as to whether or not there's any correlation between the degree to which, fathers invest and people are engaging in monogamy as a function of the degree to which people stay put versus disperse. So if there's strong matrilineality or patrilineality where people just kind of stay in one place, are you seeing variation in the degree to which they're monogamous?
Yes, you do see associations. Typically, as you move towards this, it's somewhat multidimensional, but there is a large dimensional swath of patrilineality, the patriarchal complex. You tend to see much more limited freedoms in women's sexual autonomy and so forth, and women are treated much more like items that are traded economically. And as you move more towards matrifocality, you tend to have fewer sexual restrictions, less strict sexual mores, and more promiscuity. At the extreme end, you get like the Mosuo of China and the Nayar of India, in which it really strains this idea of marriage as a human universality. They tend to be the bane of the marriage definer's existence, and trying to find a definition that also incorporates those groups. But yeah, so in those groups, you still have long-term sexual and reproductive relationships, but there's much less. They're less long-lasting, and there's much less stigma associated with promiscuity. And all things equal, when England went around to colonize the world, those were the societies that people were, the Fletcher Christensen, and they were engaging in mutiny to stay with. All things equal, I would say that they seem to be happier folk when you let women take over. That's not an endorsement of Clinton or anything like that, but just saying.
So this remark sort of dovetails with Clark's comment, and that's, I'm perfectly sympathetic with the logic of looking for, the equalizer effect in the lithic record, or just the archaeological record more broadly. But a comparative perspective, and also an ethnographic perspective, suggests that cooperation and coordination are really one of the principal leveling mechanisms, outside of even the context of cultural norms that have very strict, that we see in hunter-gatherer societies, very strict proscriptions on self-aggrandizement and so on.
Mm-hmm.
If you just look at, say, if you look at chimpanzee behavior, or you look at bonobos, the ability to successfully form coalitions often becomes more important than gross body size. And one can imagine that you could have a kind of multiple set of positive feedback systems that aren't going to show up in the archaeological record at all, where if males are becoming better at cooperative behavior, then they're becoming better at competitive scavenging, right? If we all throw our rocks at the lion at the same time, or the hyena, we can drive them off from the kill site much more easily.
Or the mean giant who's stealing everybody's wife.
Exactly, right? And that's not, that doesn't, you don't need an atlatl to do that, right? All you have to do is say we all need to act in concert. And then what we end up with is this kind of social contract arrangement, which is, we all agree to enforce some leveling system, and by virtue of that, we will then treat women differently. For example, in a variety of contexts, including the extra or non-pair reproductive context that I described earlier. And that's not going to show up in the archaeological record, right?
Perhaps ethnographically. I mean, and I would imagine that I haven't seen, or I don't know of any studies that have looked at these moral norms across societies based on mating system. But I would imagine that you would see a variance in the degree to how other-oriented individuals are in a monogamous versus polygynous population that might show up, and you, like you said, you have these feedback mechanisms because Henrik's work looking at subsequently there's this growth of monogamy around the world, that there are a number of what we would consider positive social outcomes associated with monogamy that tend to not be associated with polygynous populations, and so it could be self-reinforcing, in which these mechanisms that derive cooperation promote monogamy, which further promotes cooperation. So I guess, ethnographically, are you aware of any of the studies looking at mating systems?
No, I'm not. It seems to me that the dynamic. So one way of angling it is to look at the norms and then compare them with the psychology, right? And essentially, this kind of cooperative enforcement of limits on dyadic male-male competition is there's a public goods problem there. Potentially, each actor benefits by constraining all others to the cooperative equilibrium, but when opportunity presents itself, themselves defecting, that is, and acting in a more selfish fashion. And people certainly seem capable of that kind of flexible hypocrisy in a lot of cooperative dilemmas, and anecdotally at least, it looks like it obtains in the mating system too, where the same people who are rallying others to decry the promiscuous individual may themselves privately be promiscuous.
Well, now we've gone from talking about Clinton to Trump, so let's see if we can talk about Jeb Bush or something.
Just want to come back to what Dan was getting at in his first question, which is some concern with the extent to which one can be using human populations as part of a comparative basis, looking at animal behavior, particularly if the question is one of looking at the question of pair bonding, or things are driving towards pair bonding, which we could look at very nicely in terms of animals, variation of with animals. But what we look at with humans seems to get much more complicated. We can't just simply say, for example, marriages are equivalent of pair bonding. Because one of the factors that comes in with humans that is not true with animals is the extent to which, when we're talking about marriage, is not just the male and the female who are getting married that are concerned with that event, but rather there's a whole set of other individuals that are heavily involved with it and are directly actors in it with respect to its occurrence, conditions under which it will take place, expected behaviors that will occur after that in a way that would not be true, say, if we're looking at the question of something like pair bonding in animal species. So it seems like it's a little, one has to be a little bit careful in terms of trying to look at both, in this case, humans and animals, with respect to the fact that certainly marriage is not the equivalent of pair bonding in animals. And certainly there's this huge difference in terms of the set of individuals that are concerned about marriage and the outcomes, who gets married to whom, what are the implications of it, what happens if there is, he or she engages in mating behaviors that may not be strictly as defined within the marriage itself, in the sense of what are the consequences of that for the individuals involved in terms of all the way from societies where, in fact, it may not be of any problem whatsoever, that it happens to other cases where it can be a severe concern in terms of interests of others with respect to that.
And then there's a lot there, and I agree that oftentimes we treat these cross-cultural comparisons similarly to how we treat these cross-species comparative approaches, and with the idea that human culture and behavioral plasticity will, to some degree, mirror these evolutionary trends. And it is the case that given the remarkable variety that exists in human cultural patterns and mating systems, that you might see some of these changes. But that's dependent on the fact that we either have individual behavioral plasticity or that cultural evolution is following these similar trajectories. And I think that in any comparative analysis, there's going to be some noise just based on the vagaries of the particular evolutionary trajectory, and that noise is going to be greatly increased in a cross-cultural analysis. But all things equal, you can often expect that with a good enough sample, if we were living in a magical ideal world, that you should see similar trends. And that would lend credence to these hypotheses. And with regards to the maintaining the distinction between the pair bond and the marriage, it is something that there still is some debate, but there tends to be fair agreement that the psychological motivations for marriage, the fact that we have this capacity for long-term romantic attachment, that we write love songs and poems and do remarkably stupid things in pursuit of maintaining, winning and maintaining a long-term reproductive partner. The fact that we have this remarkable capacity for paternal concern and love suggests that we start off with the psychological and the biological substrate for pair bonds, and then it becomes wildly culturally embellished and embedded into these complex cultural systems that do make it much more than that. But that the root is still a pair bond would be the argument that I would favor.
Well, I would disagree with that severely.
Okay.
that's not the case at all. I would agree that pair bonding, let's say coming into human evolution, one wants to make a guess at it, say 400,000 years ago, to give or take.
So that'd be a reasonable estimate.
That it provides obviously a big change in terms of mating strategies when one has pair bonding and a series of other things that go along with it in terms of what's the expectation of two individuals with respect to each other beyond the emotional attachment. Obviously the whole question of provisioning, the argument that indeed one of the reasons we may have gotten into it was on the basis of provisioning in the context where females, due to secondary altriciality, are less capable of engaging in resource procurement on their own. A variety of things that could be leading to that. But the question then of why one comes up with marriage, it gets to be kind of a tricky one in the sense that there's nothing inherent in pair bonding that says it has to be given a cultural veneer or a cultural layer on top of it. And rather what seems to be going on is something quite different, which is not the question of the pair bonding per se, but the issue, but really coming out of the issue of paternity, of identifying who is considered as a male as a father of offspring, not from the viewpoint of the male himself, but from the viewpoint of the community. That is, what marriage is bringing into the fact is that pair bonding, which has to do with two individuals, primarily, that marriage is a community event in terms of where the community is concerned with the two individuals who are going to be having sex with each other and producing offspring, with respect to the relationship of the community, those two individuals, the community, and the relationship of the offspring, the community, and they want control over that. And marriage is a means of controlling that in terms of controlling how is it that offspring are being produced from the viewpoint of the community. And from the viewpoint of the individuals, they don't need marriage to reproduce.
I absolutely agree that I mean, it's a very interesting and necessary question to explore. But the presence of the cultural embellishment, I think, isn't necessarily doesn't negate the likelihood of there being some psychological, some biological precursor to that. We have great cultural embellishment surrounding food and eating, but we still, when we feel hungry, we realize that that's an evolved response. And there is a great deal of cultural variation. There are populations in which fatherhood is largely not important on the cultural sense, but the couples still form. And so there's still that natural tendency to form a long-term bond with a partner, even in the absence of this cultural importance of fatherhood and lineage. But those cases are rare.
Yeah. No, I don't disagree with that. That is, I would say that there indeed is biological substrate going on. And clearly we have emotional attachment, and obviously emotional attachment undoubtedly was beyond, is much older than marriage itself. So this is something that's there, that's present. But the cultural aspect of it is not just an embellishment. It is, in many societies, for example, the notion of romantic love is seen as the antithesis to marriage. That marriage should not involve romantic love. That in fact is seen as harmful to marriage. That marriage should be, there's going to be emotional attachment in that sense. It can take place outside of marriage, but marriage should not be centered around it. You should not have the expectation of that being part of marriage.
Yeah, no.
Really, if I can interject here, there are kind of two issues here. So one is what Dwight began with, which is the evidentiary value of marriage patterns in attempts to reconstruct patterns of prototypical,
comparative analysis,
human reproductive sociality, right? And looking at that phylogeny, and there, the argument that marriage as a cultural institution is not isomorphic with the pair bonds, and as Dwight just pointed out, in those cases where romantic love is seen as an inconsistent basis for a union, is arguably emphatically. That's a good reason for caution in reading directly from the ethnographic literature of the pattern of marriage to something about the phylogeny of pair bonding, right? But then the point that Jeff's making is that the existence of the psychology indicates that there's been a long history for this kind of, so that caveat or qualifier taken in terms of the evidentiary value of the ethnographic record as regards to marriage, right? the existence of the universal psychology, which in places is seen as the appropriate foundation for marriage, and in places is seen as completely inappropriate as a foundation for marriage. But the universal existence of the psychology, which is universal. So, it used to be the case that historians thought that romantic love was an invention of, 15th century Europe, and that's totally wrong. Right? That speaks to a deep history of pair bonding, and if that's what we're trying to reconstruct, that's relevant. Now, there has been an argument, which you haven't raised. Apostolou has argued essentially an evolutionary version of Dwight's position, right, which is what he calls parental selection theory, that because there are other parties who have control over the young couple's choices, right, who their partners will be, and those parties' interests diverge with them, the existence of parental authority in small-scale societies throughout the evolutionary history of the species has exercised selective pressure on the psychology and behavior of the actors in the union. That, I think, so that's not the argument that you're making, and empirically I think it's wrong, right? Because
I think it's a subsequent development.
yeah, but I mean, it doesn't. It looks like, as you pointed out, so that the existence of limerence and this, this intense pair bonding psychology is not about impressing her father-in-law, right? Mm-hmm. That's all secondary to gaining access to her, as it were, and such, right? So, to the extent that parents have exercised selective pressure on the psychology of the actors in the reproductive union, it's been very, very minor compared to the need for cooperation and coordination among the pair themselves. So the universal psychology is very much consistent with a deep history of pair bonding. Mm-hmm. But Dwight's point about the evidentiary value of the ethnographic record is well taken.
No, and I think that, like I was saying, these types of trajectories can occur in the comparative record as well, based on the particular histories of the phylogenies of the species. And in the cultural record, the degree to which human cultural variation is going to follow these similar trajectories and be impacted similarly by these factors is going to vary from case to case. Undoubtedly, there's probably going to be more noise and a lower signal-to-noise ratio in these analyses. Sometimes you could imagine you could come up with cases in which cultural response is so much quicker that you actually have lower noise, but I absolutely agree, though, that the caution is warranted there, as well as an entire other exploration of how marriage or these pair bonds have become what I think would become embedded into these cultural systems and then co-opted in all of these different ways to establish status, to promote cooperation, to develop gender norms and so forth. And that's a whole other fruitful world of research, I think.
Yeah, no, I think it's a problem of trying to tease them apart.
Yeah.
To separate them out rather than
That's also a problem as well.
And actually come back to the Rousseau, it's a good example for saying that indeed the emotional side, that is the attachment of the male to the female, comes forward in contexts in which there is effectively no cultural overlay, that is, or effectively no marriage system at all. This doesn't mean a disinterest on the part of males for the female for whom she's having sex with, that apparently he's engaging in parenting behavior, even though there's no recognition of it culturally, nor is there any expectation.
Yeah.
Culturally, which we sort of said that if we were to, in a sense, remove the cultural aspect of it, we would still have that underlying psychology playing itself out, and that underlying psychology is going to play itself out in the cultural context as well. But how it can, what is allowable or is acceptable, can be highly variable according to the particular cultural context. Which is, of course, why you have all kinds of stories about exactly that issue. He falls in love with her, she falls in love with him, and now the problem is,
how does that match with the cultural expectations?
He wants to marry her, but on the other kind of thing is that recognition that there is this tension between what's happening on the one side, which is what is acceptable at a community level in terms of relationship, but on the other hand, what's sort of this underlying psychology of it.
That's why.
Of course, with hunters and gatherers, we're just asking about the question of degree of polygyny. One of the, there's a sort of a tendency to look at groups like the Qom and others as sort of are typical of hunters and gatherers, but one has to also remember outspawn. With Australian groups, we get the highest rates of polygyny of any society now in hunting and gathering groups.
Yeah, that
So they
was
can be from one extreme to the other, all the way from relatively monogamous, low rates of polygyny, all the way to the highest rates of polygyny of any society.
yeah, one of the motivators for creating the standard cross-cultural sample is that before that, everything that was associated with polygyny was associated with anything that was Australian. And so they had to remove some of those from the sample.
Okay, I think we're good now.
All right.
Out of our minutes, but.
Thank you all very much. Enjoyed it.